Chapter 10 of Epochs of American History, Division and Reunion, 1829 to 1889, by Woodrow Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Constitution and Government of the Confederate States, 1861 to 1865. 117. Method of Secession. Stupendous as was the war struggle from every point of view, its deepest and most extraordinary qualities are revealed only when it is viewed from the side of the Southern Confederacy. On the part of the North it was a wonderful display of spirit and power, a splendid revelation of national strength and coherency, a capital proof of quick organic vitality throughout a great democratic body politic. A nation awoke into consciousness, shook its locks, and established its power, but its material resources for the stupendous task never lacked or were doubted. They even increased while it spent them. On the part of the South, on the other hand, the great struggle was maintained by sheer spirit and devotion, in spite of constantly diminishing resources and constantly waning hope. Her whole strength was put forth, her resources spent, exhausted, annihilated, and yet with such concentration of energy that for more than 3 years she seemed as fully equal to the contest as did the North itself. And all for a belated principle of government, an outgrown economy, an impossible purpose. There is in history no devotion, not religious, no constancy not meant for success, that can furnish a parallel to the devotion and constancy of the South in this extraordinary war. The separateness of the South in character and development we have several times spoken of. It had again and again been manifested at critical moments in the history of national politics, more and more emphatically as the rest of the country expanded and changed its character. But never had it been so manifest as it became amidst the processes of secession and war. The South then resumed, most naturally, the political methods of 1788. The whole country had acted then in adopting the new government of the Union, through conventions and through sovereign bodies. The Constitution had not been submitted to the vote of the people. As the whole country acted then, so did South Carolina and her companion states act now in the momentous winter of 1860 to 1861. Again, popular conventions became sovereign bodies. They repealed the acts of those elder conventions by which their states had come into the Union. They elected delegates to attend a common convention at Montgomery for the formation of a new confederation. And when the Montgomery Convention had framed a constitution and chosen temporary officers for the new government, they ratified its acts. Nothing went to the people until the year's term appointed for the provisional government of the Confederacy had expired. Then the people chose electors and elected members to serve in the new Congress. The electors confirmed the provisional choice of Mr. Davis and Mr. Stevens as president and vice president. This was but carrying the old theory of the sovereignty of the popular convention logically a little farther, using it to serve the pressing exigencies of a critical stage of transition, when concert and promptness of action counted for everything. It is impossible to believe that what was thus done lacked the substantial support of the people, that secession was the project of the leading classes in the South, the men in whom pride of race and of self-direction was most pronounced, is not to be doubted. Such a policy did not spring from the impulse of the great body of the white people in the South. In Georgia, at any rate, if nowhere else in the group of cotton states, there was at first a decided preponderance of opinion against any measures so extreme and hazardous. But the voting population of the Southern states was in a sense the most political in the world, the least likely to follow blindly, because the most deeply interested in politics, closely attentive to its issues and even to its personalities, sensitive to nothing more keenly than to new aspects of public affairs. It could be managed by its leaders only because it was so thoroughly homogeneous, only because it so entirely understood and sympathized with their points of view. While the political leaders of the South, therefore, carried secession on their own initiative, they carried it by persuasion, not by usurpation, by the dominion of argument rather than by mere domination of will. Men who intimately knew the minds of their fellow voters went up and down the districts where there was doubt, convinced the majority that new terms should be made with the Union and that better terms could be made out of it than in it, and gained by appeal and the communication of strong convictions that popular support without which they would have ventured to do nothing. If some were moved against their judgment, very few were moved against their principles. The principles upon which secession was attempted were indeed plain enough to everybody in the South and needed no argument. The national idea had never supplanted in the South the original theory of the Constitution. Southern opinion had stood with Calhoun all along in regarding the Constitution as an instrument of confederation, not of national consolidation. Even in the North, the national idea had been slow to grow. Webster's interpretation of the Constitution in his reply to Hayne had been a prophecy rather than a statement of accomplished fact. Even after the Southern states had acted upon the old-time theory and seceded, the North for a moment was not sure that they had acted beyond their right. It required the terrible exercise of prolonged war to impart to the national idea diffused vitality and authentic power. 118. The Confederate Constitution, 1862. The Constitution framed by the Montgomery Convention, although in most respects a reproduction of the Constitution of the United States, was made very explicit upon all points of controversy under the older instrument. The Southern leaders were not dissatisfied with the Constitution of the United States as they understood it. They were dissatisfied only with the meanings which they conceived to have been read into it by a too loose and radical interpretation. In the new Constitution which they framed for themselves, it was explicitly stated that in the adoption of the instrument each state acted in its sovereign and independent character. Protective tariffs were specifically prohibited, as well as all internal improvements at the general charge. It embodied the principle of the recognition and protection of slavery in all the territories of the new government. It added to the separate weight of the individual states by providing that in the Senate, when the question was the admission of a new state, the vote should be taken by a poll of the states, and by according to each of the several state legislatures the right to impeach Confederate officers whose duties were confined to their own territory. The demand of the three states was made sufficient to secure the calling of a convention for the amendment of the Constitution. The states were denied, on the other hand, the privilege which they had enjoyed under the federal Constitution of granting the franchise to persons not citizens under the general law of naturalization. Such other changes of the federal Constitution as were introduced were changes, for the most part, only of detail, meant to improve the older instrument where experience was thought to have shown it susceptible of alteration for the better. The presidential term was lengthened to 6 years, and the president was made ineligible for re-election. The president was given the right to veto individual items of appropriation bills, and Congress was forbidden to make any appropriations not asked for and estimated by the heads of the executive departments, except by a two-thirds vote, unless such appropriations were for the legitimate expenses of Congress itself or for the payment of just claims judicially determined upon the government. Congress was given the right to bring itself into closer cooperative relations with the executive by granting seats with the privileges of debate to the heads of the executive departments, and it was granted a partial oversight of the president's relation with his subordinates by the provision that, except in the cases of the chief executive and diplomatic agents of the government, no official should be removed except for cause explicitly stated to the Senate. The power to emit bills of credit was withheld from Congress, the slave trade was prohibited, and Congress was empowered to prevent even the introduction of slaves from the states of the Union. Much as there was among these changes that was thoroughly worth trying, it was of course impossible to test anything fairly amidst the furious storms of civil war. One of the most interesting of them, the permission to introduce the heads of the executive departments into Congress, had actually been practiced under the provisional government of 1861, but under the formal Constitution, the Houses, as was to have been expected, never took any steps towards putting it into practice. The Congress was inclined from time to time to utter some very stinging criticisms upon the executive conduct of affairs. It could have uttered them with much more dignity and effect in the presence of the officers concerned who were in direct contact with the difficulties of administration. It might then perhaps have hoped in some sort to assist in the guidance of administration. As it was, it could only criticize and then yield without being satisfied. 119 Resources of the South, 1861. For it was inevitable, in any case, in the presence of a war of such exigency, that the suggestions of the executive should be imperative, its power very little restrained. Almost every atom of force stored up in the southern country had to be gathered into a single head of strength in the stupendous struggle that ensued, and only some central and unified authority could serve the instant necessities of command. The population of the country in 1860 was 31,443,321. The states which seceded contained less than one-third of this population, and out of their 9,103,343, more than 3.5 million were slaves. The white male population of the South, reckoning all ages, was only 2,799,818, and the North was to call more than 2.5 million men into the field before the war ended. The South, moreover, was an agricultural region, and almost without material resources of any other kind. It produced all the cotton, almost all the rice, and a very large proportion of the tobacco of the country. Nearly one-third of the Indian corn came from the southern fields, hardly more than one-fifth of the wheat, however, and just one-tenth of the rye. Manufactures there were none, except here and there an isolated cotton factory or flour mill. The principal markets for the great cotton and tobacco crops, moreover, lay beyond the borders of the Confederacy. The South bought what it needed in the shape of manufactured products in the North or abroad, where its own products were sold. The wealth of the Southern states was not a money wealth. The planters had no money until their crops were sold, and most of what they received then had to be devoted to the payment of what they had borrowed in anticipation of the harvest. As the federal government increased its navy from month to month, and the blockade of the southern ports became more and more effective, the crops, which usually sold for millions, only accumulated, useless for the present, and without value, and money there was none. The value of the cotton export in 1860 was $202,741,351. In 1861 it was but 42 millions. In 1862 but 4 millions. It was money and men and arms, of course, that the Confederacy most needed. The men were at first forthcoming in abundance. President Davis's call for volunteers was as heartily responded to as was President Lincoln's. But in the matter of money and arms it was different, and even men were presently hard to get. The federal arsenals in the South had been seized by the states as they seceded, and many thousand stand of arms and a great deal of ammunition had been seized with them, for their stores had been replenished as late as the spring of 1860, when General Scott was asking leave from the Secretary of War to station troops in the South to prevent secession. Secretary Floyd had sent arms, but no soldiers. What was thus seized, however, did not suffice to equip even the Southern armies that first went into the field, and there were no manufactories of arms or ordnance in the South. 120 War Materials and Men, 1861 to 1865. Arms and military stores were sent for to England and brought in through the blockade or across Texas after transportation through Mexico. Private fowling pieces were purchased or contributed by their owners and were actually used by the troops in the field. There were muskets in use and sidearms that had come down as heirlooms from the times of the Revolution. Preparations were begun to arm some regiments with pikes. Simply brass bells of all kinds and sizes were called for to be melted down and cast into cannon. Devoted housekeepers even contributed their brass preserving kettles and everything else that they possessed that was made of brass for the same purpose. Not until the war was more than half fought out and almost decided had the necessary factories been built and equipped for the manufacture of the arms and military supplies needed by the armies. The supply of men, too, speedily proved inadequate as against the great levies of the North, and conscription was resorted to. In April 1862, the Confederate Congress passed an act making all males between the ages of 18 and 35 subject to military service, and in September of the same year, the provisions of the act were extended to all males between the ages of 18 and 45. Before the war ended, the conscription was extended even to boys of 16 and 17 and to old men. Slaves served the armies from the first in their labor upon fortifications as teamsters, hostlers, cooks, and body servants. Just before the close of the war, after much natural hesitation and debate, the Congress had, with something like the general consent, determined to enroll some of the slaves as troops. But this resolution was taken too late to be of any practical advantage or disadvantage. The principal function of the slaves throughout was to cultivate the crops, which all the white men had been obliged to leave for service in the armies, and they proved both their docility and their contented faithfulness by keeping quietly and obediently to their tasks with few but women to oversee them. 121 Financial Measures, 1861 to 1865. In its extraordinary straits for money, the government of the Confederacy had resort to every expedient known to finance, even the most desperate. It issued treasury notes by the million, payable 6 months after the close of the war, but never undertook to make them legal tender. It asked and obtained from the planters loans from their crops, promises that when their cotton was sold, the price of a certain number of the bales or of a certain proportion of the crop should be paid over to the government for the conduct of the war, 8% bonds being given in return. But as time went on, less and less of these crops could be sold, and the government was driven to make direct purchases of the products of the field, paying its 8% bonds therefore, for there was nothing else to pay. The states undertook to support their own quotas of troops so far as possible, and themselves began to make paper issue for the purpose. In some cases, supplies for the armies were taken from the people as required, and state certificates of indebtedness paid for them. The property of all alien enemies was sequestered in 1863, not without exciting great indignation. The Congress authorized the seizure of food supplies at rates of payment fixed not by the farmers but by state commissioners, who were to make their assessments of prices every 60 days. At first, both the farmers and the government had lived on credit, hoping for the sale of the crops, but at last, when credit was gone, it became necessary to live directly upon the produce of the fields. Repeated, even desperate attempts were made by the Congress to prevent, by some legislative device, even by obligatory redemption, the rapid depreciation of the vast mass of paper that had got into circulation, but of course all attempts failed, and the circulating medium became almost worthless. The crops did not fail. In 1864, the last and most disastrous year of the war, they were particularly abundant. There was no lack of corn or garden produce or rich pasture, but the means of distributing what the fields produced, of bringing it within reach of the armies and others who were almost starving, were wretchedly inadequate. The southern lines of railway were few in number and inferior in equipment, and as the war advanced, their efficiency steadily declined. So great was the demand for men in the field that few were left to keep the roads in repair, so great the scarcity of iron that there were no materials for their repair. The rails wore out and were not renewed. The running stock ran down and could not be replaced. The railways came to be controlled almost wholly by the government, too, as means of military transportation, and the main lines were extended or repaired by the use of ties and rails taken from the shorter side lines. All provident management was out of the question. 122. Character of the government, 1861 to 1865. Such trade as did make its way through the blockade was used, like everything else, to support the government. An order of the Confederate Treasury commanded that no vessel be granted a clearance unless at least one half of her cargo were shipped on government account from the otherwise unsaleable stores which the government had been accumulating. The history of the Confederacy was the history of the absorption of all the resources of the southern country into the hands of the Confederate authorities. Everything gave way, even law itself, before the inexorable exigencies of war. The executive personnel of the government was for the most part excellent, but excellence felt bound to approve itself in those days of trial and jeopardy by an energetic and effective prosecution of the war. The Congress, never meeting the heads of the departments face to face, and yet bound to provide for every executive need, was as wax in the hands of the executive. It hardly carried weight enough to make an effectual resistance. At first some men of marked ability had entered it, but there seemed greater need for leaders in the field of battle than for leaders in council. The rewards of distinction were much greater at the front than in the debates at Richmond, and the Congress was left almost stripped of men of influence and initiative. Its weight in council was still further lessened by the somewhat fictitious character of its makeup. In both the first and second Congresses of the Confederacy, members were present from Kentucky and Missouri. The people of certain portions of those states, in their passionate sympathy with the state governments in revolutionary fashion, had been sent representatives to the Confederate House and Senate, and the Confederate Congress had admitted them to seats upon the theory that they represented the real popular authorities of their states. From the first, when subjects of defense were under consideration, the sessions of the Congress had been secret. As the struggle advanced, this privacy of action was extended to a large number of other subjects, and secrecy became more and more the rule. This was due, no doubt, to a combination of influences. Military affairs engrossed most of the time and attention of the body, and it was not prudent to discuss military affairs in public. But more than that, it became increasingly difficult to command the approval of opinion out of doors for what was done by the government. Whatever might have been the necessity for the executive domination, which had been so absolutely established, the people grew very restless under it. The writ of habeas corpus had been early suspended in the South as in the North, and everyone suspected of being out of sympathy with the government was subject to arbitrary arrest. A passport system, too, had been put in force, which placed exasperating restraints upon the free movement of individuals. 123. Opposition and Despair, 1864. It was not easy to bear, even for the purposes of the war, so complete an absorption alike of all authority and of all the resources of the country into the hands of the executive as had taken place with the assistance of the Congress. Exhaustion and despair began to supervene upon the terrible exertions and sacrifices which the awful struggle had necessitated. There was a certain not inconsiderable body of opinion which from the first had not been convinced of the justice and wisdom of the war. It had yielded to the major judgment under the exasperation of coercion by the North and of federal emancipation of the slaves. These measures had set the faces of all alike as steel to endure the contest, but conservative opinion had assented to secession at the first only as a promised means of making new terms with the Union. After giving many soundest proofs of its submission to the general will, it at length grew impatient for peace. As the war advanced beyond the disasters of 1863, hope declined and despair showed itself more openly. The ports were closed, and the South was left to eat its heart out with the desperate fighting. There was no longer any shadow of hope of foreign recognition. For a time the English spinners had not felt the pinch of cotton famine. There was as much cotton in Liverpool at the beginning of the year 1862 as there had been at the beginning of 1861. And when the pinch did come, the spinners declared themselves nevertheless against slavery or the recognition of a slave government. Except for the sake of the spinners, England had nothing to gain by recognition of the Southern Confederacy. The bulk of her trade was with the North, and the North was powerful enough to resent interference. And so the demand for peace at length grew clamorous even in the South. Wholesale desertions from the Confederate Army became common, the men preferring the duty of succoring their starving families to the desperate chances of further fighting. And yet the end did not come until Sherman had made his terrible march through Georgia and the Carolinas, a march almost unprecedented in modern warfare for its pitiless and detailed rigor and thoroughness of destruction and devastation. It illustrated the same deliberate and businesslike purpose of destroying utterly the power of the South that had shown itself in the refusal of the federal government to exchange prisoners with the Confederacy. The Southern prisons were left full to overflowing with thousands upon thousands of prisoners because the South was known to be using up her population in the struggle, and it was not thought best to send any fighting men back to her. The Southern troops were themselves enduring hunger for lack of supplies, and the prisoners, too, of course, suffered severe privations, aggravated by the necessity of placing large numbers under the guard of small forces, by the difficulties of transportation, and by a demoralization in prison administration inevitable under the circumstances. It was impossible that they should be well cared for in such overwhelmingly burdensome numbers, but General Grant said that they were dying for the Union as much where they were as if they died in the field. And so the war ended with the complete prostration and exhaustion of the South. The South had thrown her life into the scales and lost it. The North had strained her great resources to the uttermost, and there had been extraordinary devotion and heroism and mastery of will on both sides. And the war was over. Nearly 1 million men had lost their lives. The federal government had spent almost $800 million of revenue upon the war and had accumulated besides a debt of nearly $3,000 million. Cities, too, and states had poured out their revenues for the purposes of the war. Untold amounts of property had been destroyed, but now it was over. The federal army of over 1 million men was rapidly disbanded, being sent home at the rate of 300,000 a month, and only 50,000 men were retained as a standing force. Now that the whirlwind had passed, there was much to be reconstructed. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Epochs of American History, Division and Reunion, 1829 to 1889, by Woodrow Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reconstruction, 1865 to 1870. 5. Rehabilitation of the Union, 1865 to 1889. 124. References. See text. 125. The Problem of Reconstruction, 1864 to 1865. The Federal Constitution, no less than the Confederate, had suffered severe strain under the weight of war. It had not been framed for times of civil strife. The President felt himself forced by circumstances to exercise an arbitrary power in many things. The Department of War became the real government of the country. Arbitrary arrests were made by the thousand, not only in the border states and where the federal armies were in occupancy, but also in the North. No one suspected of disaffection was safe. Judges were seized, mayors of cities in Maryland, members of the state legislature, and everywhere editors of newspapers and those who held peace meetings, as well as those who were accused of being spies or deserters or of resisting the draft. The President suspended the writ of habeas corpus as he pleased, Congress following many months behind him in acts validating what he did. Men of all ranks and conditions lay imprisoned without hope of trial. There was, of course, no purpose of absolutism in all this. Mr. Lincoln did all things with a wakeful conscience, and certainly without any love of personal power for its own sake, seeing substantial justice done to wherever he could, but the Constitution was sadly strained nevertheless. The close of the war, while it removed the old stress, put a new and even severer one upon the Constitution, and Mr. Lincoln was no longer present to exercise a restraining wisdom. Now that the war was over, what was the status of the states which had attempted secession? Were they still members of the Union, and could their participation in its affairs be resumed just where it had been left off? Here was another situation for which the Constitution had made no provision. If, as the Supreme Court subsequently held in the leading case of Texas versus White, the government from which they had sought to withdraw was an indestructible union of indestructible states, they had, in legal theory at any rate, succeeded neither in severing their connection with the federal government nor in destroying their own existence as states. They were still states, and states in the Union. But what sort of states, and in what condition? In what relation did they now stand to the government they had sought to destroy? The President and Congress had not been in agreement upon these questions. Congress had not even been careful to be consistent with itself in its actions concerning them. It had recognized, as we have seen, the revolutionary government set up in the western counties of Virginia in 1861 as the regular government of the whole state, and had acted upon its consent in erecting the state of West Virginia. But when the officers of that government afterwards removed to Alexandria and set up its rule over such counties as were within the federal lines, Congress began to withdraw its recognition. At first it admitted both to the Senate and to the House persons sent to represent the Virginia of this government, but after 1863 it declined any longer to receive its representatives, although it meanwhile permitted one of its senators to remain until his death and the other until the expiration of his term. The President had held a very consistent theory and pursued a very consistent course from the first. While he conceived secession to have broken up the governments of the states engaged against the Union, he also deemed it his duty to resume full civil relations with such portions of the South as had been reduced to obedience, and to see that regular and legitimate governments were constituted in them as soon as possible. Acting under his constitutional power to grant reprieves and pardons, as well as by authorization of an act of Congress of July of the previous year, he had issued a proclamation of amnesty so early as December 1863. Full forgetfulness and full restoration to all property rights except those in slaves were offered to all who would take oath faithfully to support, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Union of the States thereunder, and in like manner abide by and faithfully support all acts of Congress or proclamations of the President with reference to slaves, so long and so far as not repealed, modified, or held void by Congress or by decision of the Supreme Court. Certain classes of persons who had taken a prominent part in secession, or who had left the service of the United States for the service of the Southern Confederacy, were excepted from the amnesty, but for the rest it was declared that in any state which had attempted secession so soon as 1/10 of the voters of 1860 should have qualified by taking the oath and should have set up governments Republican in form under the meaning of the Constitution, those governments would be recognized by the federal executive, although Congress would have to determine for itself the question of admitting representatives elected under their authority to seats in the houses. Arkansas had been reorganized under the federal authority substantially after this fashion in 1863 before the proclamation, and before the presidential election of 1864 Mr. Lincoln had recognized new governments in Louisiana and Tennessee. But when electoral votes were sent in from Louisiana and Tennessee, the houses refused to receive them, and this notwithstanding the fact that the representatives from Louisiana had been admitted to seats in the House during the last month of the preceding Congress. 126 Policy of Andrew Johnson, 1865. Mr. Lincoln's death made no break in the presidential theory with regard to the right constitutional method of Reconstruction, for Mr. Johnson, the Vice President, held views upon the subject practically identical with those upon which Mr. Lincoln had acted. But the change of presidents made all the difference possible in the manner and temper of executive action. Johnson had not a touch of Lincoln's genius for understanding and persuading men. Of equally humble origin, he had risen by virtue of a certain pugnacious force and initiative of character to high posts of public trust. But his powers had never been schooled or refined as Lincoln's had been. They always retained their native roughness. He was rash, headstrong, aggressive to the last. The party which had elected him, too, was already inclined to suspect him. Although a Union man, he had been a Democrat. He had been senator from Tennessee when that state seceded, but had treated her act of secession with contempt, ignoring it and remaining at his post in the Senate. He sympathized with Southern men, however, in almost everything except their hostility to the Union, held strict views of state rights, and with an ardor and stubbornness characteristic of him, and was sure to yield nothing for the sake of accommodation. He could not be right without so exasperating his opponents by his manner of being right as to put himself practically in the wrong. During the first 8 months of his presidency, there was no chance for Congress to interfere until the Houses should meet December 4, 1865. He could have his own way in dealing with the Southern states. The governments of Arkansas, Louisiana, and Tennessee had already been reorganized by the voters who could take the oath of Mr. Lincoln's amnesty proclamation. In Virginia, the Alexandria government had called together a convention elected by the counties within the federal lines in the spring of 1864, and that convention had adopted a constitution which embodied the ideas of Mr. Lincoln's proclamation, the abolition of slavery, and the disfranchisement of those who had taken prominent parts under the Confederacy. In May 1865, upon President Johnson's refusing to recognize the governor whom the Virginians had elected under the Confederacy, the Alexandria government became the regular government of the state. The Constitution of 1864, with some modifications but still retaining its prohibition of slavery, was adopted by the people. The president pushed forward the processes of Reconstruction in the other states. May 29, 1865, he put forth an amnesty proclamation, which was substantially the same as Mr. Lincoln's, although it considerably increased the list of those who were to be excluded from its privileges. By the middle of July, he had appointed provisional governors in all the states not yet reorganized. The voters in those states who could qualify under the proclamation at once proceeded to hold constitutional conventions and erect governments under them, being assured of the president's recognition and support should they agree to the abolition of slavery and establish governments which seemed to him Republican in form within the meaning of the Constitution. In every state except Texas, these processes were complete by the autumn of 1865, and senators and representatives from the southern states were ready to apply for admission to their seats when Congress should convene. The new Southern legislatures, moreover, had in the meanwhile ratified an amendment to the Constitution which Congress had adopted the previous winter, and without their ratification this amendment would lack that assent of 3/4 of the states which the terms of the Constitution made indispensable to its validity. February 1, 1865, Congress had proposed to the states a 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which should prohibit both slavery and involuntary servitude within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction, except as a punishment for crime, thus recalling the terms of the Wilmot Proviso and of the celebrated Ordinance of 1787 for the government of the Northwest Territory. West Virginia, Maryland, and Missouri, to whose territories Mr. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had not applied, had by constitution or statute already begun a process of emancipation. If the proclamation had legal validity, slavery existed only in Kentucky and Delaware. Those two states refused to ratify the amendment. Texas, which had not yet effected the organization of a new government, and Mississippi and Florida did not act upon it at this time. It was accepted by 11 of the former slaveholding states, however, together with 16 free states, and on December 18, the Secretary of State, Mr. Seward, made official proclamation of its embodiment in the Constitution by the constitutional vote of 27 of the 36 states. If the Southern states did not have regular and legitimate governments, was this amendment valid? 127 Acts of Southern Legislatures, 1865 to 1866. Congress had come together, however, on December 4, 1865, in no temper to look with favor upon new governments of the Southern states, while the Southern conventions met for Reconstruction, had adopted constitutions which abolished slavery, and the legislatures organized under those constitutions had adopted the 13th Amendment, and so apparently given earnest of the acceptance by the South of the results of the war. Those very legislatures had immediately proceeded to pass laws which seemed to embody a deliberate purpose to keep the Negroes in involuntary servitude, if not in virtual slavery. In most respects, the Negroes were put at once upon a footing of equitable equality with the whites in all civil rights, but the Southern legislatures could not but regard with profound apprehension the new, unaccustomed, unpracticed, and yet wholly unrestrained liberty of so vast a laboring, landless, homeless class. In several of the states, accordingly, notably in Mississippi and South Carolina, statutes were passed with regard to employment, labor, contracts, and vagrancy, which singled out the Negroes for subjection to very stringent and exceptional restraints. Those who would not work at the current rates of wages were to be considered vagrants and subject to unusual penalties. A great number of the minor but more annoying and demoralizing offenses likely to be committed by the freedmen were made punishable by fine, and if the fine could not be paid, the culprit was to be hired out to work by judicial process. An apprentice system was in some instances adopted, by which all minor Negroes were made subject to be bound out to labor until they should attain a certain age. Written contracts, labor, or else licenses to perform job work issued by the mayors or police authorities of their places of residence were in great many cases required, which the Negroes must show when challenged in that regard to avoid charge of vagrancy, and if proved vagrants they could be arrested, fined, and made to pay off the fine by compulsory labor. 128. The Temper of Congress, 1865. To the Southern lawmakers, such restraint and compulsion seemed to be demanded by ordinary prudence for the control and at least temporary discipline of a race so recently slaves, and therefore so unfit to exercise their new liberty, even with advantage to themselves, without some checks put upon them. But to Congress they seemed plain and wilful violations of the freedom of the Negro, evidences of an open and flagrant recalcitrancy against the results of the war. Opinions were beginning to prevail among the members which looked towards a radical policy of Reconstruction which should subject the Southern states completely to the will of Congress. The Constitution having, of course, failed to provide for such a situation as that which now existed, many theories had been held with regard to the status of the Southern states after their defeat. Some believed that, although the ordinances of secession had been legally null and void, the Southern states had, by their resistance to the laws of the Union, divested themselves of statehood, and had, when defeated, become not states again, but mere conquered possessions of the federal government. A territory, by coming into the Union, becomes a state, and a state, by going out of the Union, becomes a territory. Others held, with Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, that the resistance of the South to the Constitution and laws of the Union had suspended all federal law so far as they were concerned, and that law did not revive with regard to them until once more declared in force because of fully renewed conditions of obedience by the lawmaking and war-making power of the general government, that is, by Congress. Congress, therefore, could reconstruct the Southern states as it pleased and revive the federal Constitution with regard to them only when it had finished. This was the theory which Congress practically adopted. It came together in December with a Republican majority obtained in 1864. A strong delegation of Republicans chosen under military superintendents in the border states raised that majority to more than two-thirds in both houses. A force of strong enough, if united in opinion, to carry through any policy it chose, with the motto thorough. When organizing, the names of all of the states that had seceded were omitted in the roll call, and immediately upon effecting an organization, a concurrent resolution was passed by the two houses, appointing a joint committee of 9 representatives and 6 senators to inquire into the condition of the seceding states and to advise Congress upon the question of their being entitled to representation under their existing organizations. By the opening of March 1866, a joint resolution had passed to the effect that neither senators nor representatives should be received from the Southern states until Congress should declare them entitled to representation by full readmission to the Union. This was meant to checkmate the presidential scheme of reorganization. The House had already resolved that the troops should be kept at their stations in the South until their recall should be directed by congressional action. The temper of Congress had been raised to this pitch of authoritativeness by the irritations to which it was subjected from two quarters. It was annoyed that the President should have hastened to be beforehand with it in reorganizing and practically reinstating the Southern governments, and it was exasperated by the laws which the Southern legislatures had passed in despite of the freedom of the blacks. That legislation proved of comparatively little effect, for the last Congress had, by an act of March 3, 1865, established in the War Department a Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, to which it had given very wide authority to assist the somewhat bewildered and quite helpless hosts of liberated slaves in finding means of subsistence and in establishing their new privileges and immunities. And the officers of this bureau had been even officiously active in securing for the Negroes the protection of federal authority against and all unfriendly discriminations of local law. But that the Southern legislation was of slight practical importance did not render it the less offensive to the Republican majority in Congress. 129. The President versus Congress, 1866. The law which established the Freedmen's Bureau had limited its existence to 1 year. On February 6, 1866, therefore, another bill was passed, continuing it indefinitely. But besides continuing it, the bill proposed very greatly to increase its powers and made any attempt to obstruct, interfere with, or abridge the civil rights and immunities of the freedmen a penal offense to be adjudged and punished by federal military tribunals. The President vetoed the measure, alleging, among other reasons for his action, the fact that the bill had been passed by a Congress in which the Southern states were not represented. An attempt to pass the measure over the President's veto failed of the necessary majorities. There were some members among the Republicans who were not yet prepared for an open breach with the executive, but the President was rash and intemperate enough to force a consolidation of the majority against him. Having occasion to make a public speech on February 22, he spoke of Congress in the most bitter terms of contempt and condemnation, ascribing to its leaders disloyal and even criminal motives. In March, Congress showed how it meant to respond by taking the government into its own hands and making law over his veto. It sent to the President a civil rights bill declaring all persons born in the United States and not subject to any foreign power citizens of the United States, denouncing penalties against all interferences with the civil rights of any class of citizens, and giving to officers of the United States the right to prosecute and to the federal courts alone the right to try all such offenses. The President vetoed the bill as both unwise and in excess of the constitutional powers of Congress. It was promptly passed over his veto, and Congress moved on to complete its policy without his assistance. 130. The Congressional Program, 1866. Not wholly undisturbed, it would seem, by the President's constitutional objections to the Civil Rights Bill, Congress proposed to the states in June 1866 the 14th Amendment to the Constitution to incorporate the principles of the bill in the fundamental law. It made all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof citizens both of the United States and of the several states of their residence, provided for a reduction of the congressional representation of any state that should withhold the franchise from any male citizens of the voting age, excluded from federal office the most prominent servants of the Confederacy until Congress should pardon them, and invalidated all debts or obligations incurred in aid of insurrection or rebellion against the United States. The acceptance of this amendment by the Southern states was to be regarded as a condition precedent to their recognition by Congress. In July, a bill continuing the Freedmen's Bureau for 2 years, directing the sale of public lands to the Negroes on easy terms, appropriating the property of the Confederate government to their education, and providing military protection for their rights, was passed over the President's veto. By an act of July 24, 1866, Tennessee, which had already accepted the 14th as well as the 13th Amendment, was admitted to representation in Congress. 4 days later, Congress adjourned. Before the adjournment, the Joint Committee of 15, which had charge of the congressional policy of Reconstruction, presented a report June 18, admirably adapted to serve as a manifesto and campaign document, for a new House of Representatives was to be elected before Congress should convene again. It declared that the governments of the states recently in secession were practically suspended by reason both of the irregular character of the new governments which had been set up and of the reluctant acquiescence of the Southern people in the results of the war, and that it was essential to the preservation of the Union that they should not be reinstated in their former privileges by Congress until they should have given substantial pledges of loyalty and submission. The President's friends, on their part, both Republicans and Democrats, got together in convention and made a demonstration of adherence to the President and his policy of Reconstruction, which did not fail of producing a considerable impression. But the President hastened to utter violent speeches which swelled the number of his radical opponents as rapidly as the leaders of the congressional majority could have desired. On a midsummer trip to Chicago, he made coarse and intemperate attacks upon Congress at almost every stopping place. In October, the Southern states began to reject, one after another, the 14th Amendment. In December, Congress came together, triumphant and ready to push its triumph. The next House had been elected and was to contain as huge a Republican majority as the present House. It now only remained to formulate the means by which the Southern states were to be forced to accept the amendment. 131 Reconstruction by Congress, 1867 to 1870. A caucus of Republican members framed a program, and Congress carried it out with a high hand over whatever vetoes Mr. Johnson ventured to interpose. It was provided that Congress should convene on the 4th of March instead of in December, in order to deprive the President of the opportunity for the exercise of authority afforded by the long congressional recess. The rules were strengthened which were to prevent Southern members from getting their names upon the roll at the organization of the new Congress. An act was passed known as the Tenure of Office Act, making the President's power of removal from office, as well as his power of appointment, subject to the approval of the Senate. And a writer to the appropriation bill made General Grant, already in charge of the whole military force of the government, practically independent of the President in his command. Universal suffrage was established in the District of Columbia, and in the territories. Nebraska was admitted to the Union March 1, 1867. Nevada had been added to the list of states October 31, 1864. These measures were but to establish the authority and prestige of the majority. They simply cleared the way for the great Reconstruction Act, which became law March 2, 1867. On March 4, the new Congress convened. Before the end of the month, it had passed a supplementary act which completed this extraordinary legislation, and the process of disciplinary and compulsory Reconstruction went forward at once. The Southern states, with the exception of Tennessee, which had already been admitted to representation, were to be grouped in 5 military districts, which were to be put under the command of generals of the army appointed by the President. These military commanders were themselves to conduct the process of Reconstruction. They were to enroll in each state upon oath all the male citizens of 1 year's residence, not disqualified to vote by reason of felony or excluded under the terms of the proposed 14th Amendment. And they were then to hold an election in each state for delegates to a state convention, in which only registered voters should be permitted to vote or to stand as candidates, the number of delegates to be chosen being apportioned according to the registered vote in each voting district. These conventions were to be directed to frame constitutions extending the franchise to all classes of citizens who had been permitted to vote for delegates. The constitutions so framed were to be submitted to the same body of voters for ratification, and if adopted were to be sent to Congress through the President for its approval. When its constitution should have been approved by Congress, each of the reconstructed states was to be readmitted to representation as soon as its new legislature had ratified the 14th Amendment. Meanwhile, its government was to be deemed provisional only, and in all respects subject to the paramount authority of the United States at any time to abolish, control, or supersede the same. Such was the policy of Thoreau to which Congress had made up its mind. Its practical operation was, of course, revolutionary in its effects upon the Southern governments. The most influential white men were excluded from voting for the delegates who were to compose the constitutional conventions, while the Negroes were all admitted to enrollment. Unscrupulous adventurers appeared to act as the leaders of the inexperienced blacks in taking possession first of the conventions and afterwards of the state governments. And in the states where the Negroes were most numerous, or their leaders most shrewd and unprincipled, an extraordinary carnival of public crime set in under the forms of law. Negro majorities gained complete control of the state governments, or rather Negroes constituted the legislative majorities and submitted to the unrestrained authority of small and masterful groups of white men, whom the instinctive plunder had drawn from the North. Taxes were multiplied, whose proceeds went for the most part into the pockets of these fellows and their confederates among the Negroes. Enormous masses of debt were piled up by processes both legal and fraudulent, and most of the money borrowed reached the same destination. In several of the states it is true that after the conventions had acted, the white vote was strong enough to control when united, and in these Reconstruction, when completed, reinstated the whites in power almost at once. But it was in these states in several cases that the process of Reconstruction was longest delayed, just because the white voters could resist the more obnoxious measures of the conventions, and in the meantime there was military rule. By the end of June 1868, provision had been made for the readmission of Arkansas, the two Carolinas, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana to representation in Congress. Reconstruction was delayed in Virginia, Mississippi, and Texas because of the impossibility of securing popular majorities for the constitutions framed by the reconstructing conventions, and Georgia was again held off from representation for a time because her laws had declared Negroes ineligible to hold office. It was not until January 30, 1871, therefore, that all of the states were once more represented in Congress. Meantime, however, a sufficient number of ratifications had been obtained for the 14th Amendment, and on the 28th of July, 1868, it was finally proclaimed part of the fundamental law. A 15th Amendment, moreover, had been added. February 26, 1869, Congress had proposed an amendment specifically forbidding either the United States or any state to deny or abridge the right of citizens of the United States to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And it was agreed to make it a further condition precedent to the admission of Virginia, Georgia, Mississippi, and Texas, belated in their Reconstruction, that their legislatures should ratify this as well as the 14th Amendment. It was adopted by the necessary number of states and finally declared in force March 30, 1870. 132. Impeachment of the President, 1868. The congressional policy of Thoreau had not been carried through without forcing to an issue of direct hostility the differences between Congress and President Johnson. The President's repeated vetoes of its most important measures, his open utterance of the most bitter contempt for it, his belligerent condemnation upon every ground of its policy of Reconstruction, had rendered Congress as intemperate and aggressive as Mr. Johnson himself. And at the last the unedifying contest was pushed to the utmost limit. The Tenure of Office Act of March 1867 had sought to deprive the President of the power of removing even cabinet officers without the approval of the Senate. In August, during the congressional recess, Mr. Johnson demanded the resignation of Edwin M. Stanton, the Secretary of War, whom he had retained in office along with the other members of Mr. Lincoln's cabinet. Mr. Stanton refused to resign, and the president suspended him from office as the terms of the act permitted him to do. But when Congress reassembled, the Senate refused to sanction the removal. Mr. Johnson thereupon resolved to ignore the Tenure of Office Act, which seemed to him a palpable invasion of his constitutional privileges, and force Congress to an issue. Again he removed Stanton. Again Stanton refused to quit his office, appealing to the House for protection. On February 24, 1868, the House resolved to impeach the president for high crimes and misdemeanors. The trial was begun in the Senate on the 5th of March. A vote was reached on several of the articles of impeachment on May 16, and the vote stood 35 for conviction, 19 for acquittal. 5 Republican senators had declined to vote with their party, and the two-thirds majority necessary for conviction could not be secured. A verdict of acquittal was entered. The Secretary of War resigned his office. The president had won the fight against the obnoxious act. But he had hardly won it with dignity, for while the trial was actually in progress, he had gone about the country as before, pouring out passionate speeches against Congress. 133 Presidential Campaign of 1868. Mr. Johnson was a Democrat, and the views which he had so passionately striven for in the matter of the reconstruction of the Southern states were the views of the Democratic Party. He had not won the confidence of the Democrats, however, by earning the hostility of the Republicans. So far as the presidency was concerned, he was, it turned out, as impossible a candidate for either party as Mr. Tyler had been. The Republican nominating convention, which met in Chicago on the 20th of May, 1868, just 4 days after the failure of the impeachment trial, unanimously and with genuine enthusiasm named General Grant for the presidency, trusting him as a faithful officer and no politician. The Democrats who met in New York on the 4th of July nominated Horatio Seymour of New York. Issue was squarely joined in the platforms upon the policy of Reconstruction, but the result was not doubtful. 3 of the Southern states were shut out from taking part in the election because not yet reconstructed, and most of the rest were in possession of Negro majorities. While most of the Northern states were of a mind to support Congress in its policy of thorough towards the South, 214 electoral votes were cast for the Republican candidates, 80 for the Democratic, though the aggregate popular majority of the Republicans was but little more than 300,000 in a total vote of nearly 6 millions. The 4 months which remained to Mr. Johnson as president passed quickly away, and on the 4th of March, 1869, General Grant assumed the responsibilities of successor to the stormy Tennessean. Mr. Johnson's 4 years of office had certainly been among the most tempestuous and extraordinary in the history of the country, their legislative record crowded with perplexities for the constitutional lawyer and the judicious historian alike. One event of no little significance had marked the foreign relations of the government. In 1862, France had undertaken to interfere in the affairs of the distracted Mexican Republic by setting up a throne there for the Archduke Maximilian of Austria, an amiable and enlightened prince who deserved a function worthier of his powers. French troops established and sought to maintain the monarchy in the interest of the clerical and landed classes of Mexico. But the United States viewed the movement with hostility from the first, and so soon as the Civil War was over, added to protests a significant concentration of troops upon the Mexican border. The French thereupon withdrew, but Maximilian thought it his duty to remain, only to fall into the hands of ruthless opponents and meet his death by condemnation of a military commission, June 19, 1867. The Monroe Doctrine had been successfully asserted with truly tragical consequences. The year 1867 saw a still further addition of territory to the United States by the purchase of Alaska from the Russian government for a little more than $7 million. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Epochs of American History, Division and Reunion, 1829 to 1889, by Woodrow Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Return to normal conditions 1870 to 1876. 134. Restoration of normal conditions. The year 1876 marked not only a point of national sentiment in the completion of 100 years of independence, but also a real turning point in the history of the country. Normal conditions of government and of economic and intellectual life were at length restored. The period of Reconstruction was past. Congress had ceased to exercise extra constitutional powers. Natural legal conditions once more prevailed. Negro rule under unscrupulous adventurers had been finally put an end to in the South, and the natural, inevitable ascendancy of the whites, the responsible class, established. Something like the normal balance of national parties also had been restored. Votes were beginning to lose their reminiscence of the war and to become regardful first of all of questions of peace. Economic forces, too, recovering from the past, were gathering head for the future. The nation was made to realize this when it took stock of its resources at the great Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. At last the country was homogeneous and had subordinated every other sentiment to that of hope. General Grant remained president for 2 terms, and the 8 years of his incumbency were years at once of consummation and of recuperation, during which the Republican Party completed its policy of Reconstruction, and the country pulled itself together for the new and better career that was before it. Congress hastened, after the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, to support them by penal legislation. May 31, 1870, and April 20, 1871, laws were enacted, popularly known as the Force Bills, which announced fine and imprisonment against all hindrances or interferences, either attempted or accomplished in restraint of the exercise of the franchise by the Negroes or the counting of the votes cast by them. And the courts of the United States were given exclusive cognizance of all offenses under these acts. There was unquestionably a deliberate and more or less concerted effort made by the whites of the South to shut the Negro out by some means from an effectual use of his vote, and sometimes this effort took the most flagrant forms of violence. Presently, however, its more overt and violent features disappeared, and in the spring of 1872 Congress suffered some of the harsher portions of the force legislation of the previous year to lapse. May 22, 1872, it even passed a General Amnesty Act, which relieved of their political disabilities most of those persons in the South who had been excluded from political privileges by previous legislation, excepting only those who had served the Confederacy after having been officers in the judicial, military, or naval service of the United States, or officials in the higher grades of administrative and political function. The Supreme Court, moreover, began to throw its weight of authority decisively on the side of a conservative construction of the legal changes wrought by war, Reconstruction, and constitutional amendment. While it sustained the political authority of Congress in the matter even of its extreme policy of Reconstruction in Texas versus White, holding that the lawmaking power could mend as it chose the broken relations of the Southern states to the Union, it maintained even in that case that the states retained their statehood intact, and when it came in the so-called slaughterhouse cases, 1873, to interpret the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, it pronounced the powers of the Southern states unimpaired, declaring that their control over the privileges of their citizens was in no wise changed by the constitutional provisions which had placed the special privileges of citizens of the United States under the protection of the federal government. In subsequent cases, it went even farther in recalling Congress to the field of the Constitution. 135. Election troubles in the South, 1872 to 1876. Election troubles were of constant recurrence in those southern states in which the Negroes were most numerous or most thoroughly organized under their white leaders, and the federal government was repeatedly called upon to exercise the extraordinary powers which recent legislation had put into its hands. It would be very difficult to say with which party to these contests full legal right rested. On the one hand, the Negro managers were in possession of the electoral machinery, were backed by the federal supervisors, marshals, and deputy marshals, whom Congress had authorized to superintend the voting for the protection of the Negroes, and were naturally bold to use such a situation for their own advantage. Their opponents, on the other hand, were able, oftentimes when they could not control the polls, to keep the Negroes away from them by persuasion, reward, intimidation, or actual violence. In several of the states, returning boards had been created by law to make final canvass of the results of all state or federal elections, and even judicial determination of their validity. The control of these boards became, of course, an advantage of the greatest strategic importance to the contending parties. In Louisiana, in the autumn of 1872, rival returning boards, both irregularly constituted but both claiming full official authority, certified the one a Democratic, the other a Republican majority in the choice of presidential electors and state officers. Two rival governments were set up. Federal troops intervened in support of the Republican governor, and although a subsequent compromise effected under congressional direction gave a majority of the House of Representatives of the state legislature to the governor's opponents, he was himself left in office and authority. In 1874 and 1875, similar electoral difficulties led to calls for federal troops from Republican officials about to be ousted in Arkansas and Mississippi. But no troops were sent. The climax of the trouble was to come in connection with the presidential election of 1876. General Grant was careful to justify his course in directing the interference of federal troops in the contested election troubles in Louisiana by an appeal to the guarantee clause of the Constitution, under which the United States guarantees to every state a republican form of government and protection against domestic violence. But he declared that while he felt bound to intervene, he found it an exceedingly unpalatable duty, and when calls for troops came later from other states, he replied with evident impatience that the whole public was tired out with these annual autumnal outbreaks in the South, and that the great majority were ready now to condemn any interference on the part of the government. He had never shown any vindictive feeling towards the South, and there can be no doubt that in directing federal troops to interfere to cut the puzzling knots of Southern election snarls, he acted with the same simple sense of duty towards the laws that had characterized his soldier predecessors, Jackson and Taylor. 136 Executive Demoralization, 1869 to 1877. During the first term of his presidency, this soldierly simplicity and directness served the purposes of government sufficiently well, for the tasks of the moment were not those of ordinary civil administration, in which he had had no experience. The president, too, showed a sincere desire to keep the public service pure and efficient. March 3, 1871, Congress, in tardy response to a healthful movement of public opinion out of doors, passed an act which authorized the president to frame and administer through the commission such rules as he thought best for the regulation of admissions to the civil service. And the measure met with General Grant's prompt and hearty approval. He appointed leading friends of the reform upon the commission, and for 3 years after January 1, 1872, notwithstanding the opposition of the politicians, a system of competitive examinations for appointments to office was maintained by the president. In December 1874, Congress refused any longer to vote money to sustain the work of the commission. Despite his honorable intention, however, General Grant did not prove fortunate in his selection of counselors and subordinates. He found that choosing political advisers on the nomination of politicians was quite different from promoting tested officers in the army. And when his work was over, he confessed with characteristic simplicity and frankness that he had been deceived and had failed. In 1875, it was found that there was concerted action in the West between distillers and federal officials to defraud the government of large amounts in respect of the internal revenue tax on distilled spirits. The Secretary of War, W. Belknap, was impeached for accepting bribes in dispensing the patronage of his department and resigned his office to escape condemnation. During the whole of General Grant's second term of office, a profound demoralization pervaded the administration. Inefficiency and fraud were suspected even where they did not exist. The soldier president showed no great wisdom either in such features of foreign policy as he sought to originate. It was his favorite idea that San Domingo, the Africanized Republic of the Ostend Manifesto, ought to be annexed to the United States because it might, in case of war, be used by a hostile power as a military rendezvous at our very doors. And he yielded very reluctantly, though gracefully enough, to the opposition which made the realization of the plan impossible. Several serviceable treaties, however, marked the period of his incumbency. Of these, the most worthy of mention was the Treaty of Washington, concluded with Great Britain May 8, 1871. This treaty provided for a clearer definition of the northwestern boundary, a portion of which had been too vaguely determined by the Treaty of 1847, for the settlement of certain questions touching alleged interferences with American fishermen in Canadian waters, and for the arbitration of claims made by the United States against Great Britain on account of the fitting out in British ports of certain Confederate vessels of war which had wrought havoc among the northern shipping. These last were called the Alabama claims because they chiefly concerned the equipment in England of the Confederate cruiser Alabama. An amicable settlement of all the questions covered by the treaty was effected. In September 1872, arbitrators appointed under the terms of the treaty by Brazil, Italy, Switzerland, Great Britain, and the United States awarded to the United States $50 million in damages on account of the Alabama claims. 137 legislative scandals, 1872 to 1873. Congress, too, as well as the administration, had suffered a certain serious degree of demoralization, in consequence, no doubt, of the prolonged and unobstructed domination of a triumphant party majority. In 1869, both the Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railways had been completed across the continent by aid of enormous government grants. A corporation known as the Crédit Mobilier, chartered by the legislature of Pennsylvania, had taken charge of the construction of the Union Pacific and of its interests in the money market. And in 1872, grave scandals began to come to light concerning its operations. It was publicly alleged that the Vice President, Mr. Colfax, the Vice President-elect, Mr. Henry Wilson, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and a number of senators and representatives had been bribed to further the interests of the company in Congress. Upon the convening of Congress in December 1872, a committee of investigation was appointed in the House upon the motion of the Speaker. Its report, made February 18, 1873, showed clear proof of guilt against 2 members of the House, exonerated others on the ground that they had had no knowledge of the illegitimate purposes of the operations in which they had confessedly taken part, and left resting upon a number of others a painful suspicion of disgraceful motives, even in the absence of conclusive proof of their guilt. The impression made upon the country was that a corrupt congressional ring had been partially unearthed, and this unfavorable impression concerning congressional motives was only heightened by an act passed the same session which the public press very bluntly dubbed the salary grab. By this act, the compensation of senators and representatives was increased, and the increase was made to apply retrospectively to the salaries of the members of the existing Congress. The next session saw this scandalous measure repealed. 138. Serviceable legislation, 1870 to 1875. For the rest, Congress showed itself capable during these 8 years of some very serviceable legislation, though it was not always steadfast in maintaining the good it did. It authorized a thorough reform of the civil service, as we have seen in 1871, only to abandon it again for the spoils system in 1874. An act of July 14, 1870, amended the naturalization laws. It admitted to citizenship, besides free white persons, aliens of African nativity, and persons of African descent. This was a completion of the policy of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. It also made stringent provision against the fraudulent naturalization and registration of aliens, appointing federal supervisors to enforce its regulations in that regard in cities of over 20,000 inhabitants. January 14, 1875, an act became law which provided for the resumption of specie payments by the government on the 1st of January, 1879. Congress had very narrowly escaped being deprived by the Supreme Court of the power of making its irredeemable paper issues legal tender for all debts, as it had done in 1862. A decision of that court, rendered in December 1869, pronounced such legislation unconstitutional, but the decision was agreed to by only a small majority of the justices. By the following spring, the personnel of the court had been materially altered by the appointment of 2 new justices, and in March 1870, the court thus reorganized reversed the decision of December and affirmed the constitutionality of the legislation of 1862. The resumption of specie payments, however, was nonetheless imperatively demanded by the business sense of the country. 139. Reaction against the Republicans, 1870 to 1876. General Grant had been elected to his second term of office in 1872 without formidable opposition, but there had been signs even then of reaction against the Republican policy, and before the end of his second term that reaction had gathered very formidable head, indeed, having swept away the Republican majority in the House of Representatives and brought on a contested presidential election. There had been an influential element in the Republican Party from the first which, although it had supported the party cordially for the sake of the Union, had given its support only provisionally, with a potential, if not an actual, independence of judgment. There was another element, too, of war Democrats, whose allegiance was still looser, still more openly conditional. These elements, as well as a great many earnest conservative men who accounted themselves without qualification staunch Republicans, were very soon seriously alienated from the party by its extreme measures of coercion in the South in support of the constitutional amendments, its constant military interference there, in despite of the principle of local self-government, the arrogant temper of mastery with which it insisted upon its aggressive policy, and the apparent indifference with which it viewed the administrative demoralization which so soon became manifest under General Grant. So early as 1870, these forces of reaction had produced a liberal Republican Party in Missouri, which, by combining with the Democrats, presently gained complete control of the government of that state. By 1872, this liberal Republican movement had greatly spread, assuming even national importance. In May 1872, a general mass meeting of the adherents of the new party gathered in Cincinnati, and after adopting a thoroughly Democratic platform, was led by a singular combination of influences to nominate for the presidency Mr. Horace Greeley, the able, erratic, stridently Republican editor of the New York Tribune, and for the vice presidency Mr. B. Gratz Brown, the liberal Republican leader of Missouri. The Democratic nominating convention accepted both the platform and the candidates of this meeting, but no Democrat could vote with real heartiness for the ticket. While the Republicans gained 600,000 votes over 1868, the Democratic vote increased only 130,000. And General Grant, who had been renominated by the unanimous choice of his party, was made president again. The most substantial result of the reaction was a perceptible increase in the opposition vote in Congress. It was significant of the clearing away of the war influences that parties now began to form which manifested no great interest in Reconstruction questions. 1872 saw conventions of a Labor Party and of a Prohibitionist Party which framed platforms and nominated candidates for the presidency and the vice presidency. In 1873 and 1874 there emerged in the West an association of patrons of husbandry, more generally known as Grangers, which imperatively thrust forward the interests of the farmer in the politics of several of the Western states, and induced their considerable legislative interference with railway transportation. Although it miscarried In its attempts against the Republican strength in 1872, the opposition movement steadily gathered head. The corruption of the administration was brought more and more painfully to light. The financial distress of 1873 seemed to many who suffered from it to be connected in some way with the financial policy of the dominant party. Influences large and small set against the Republicans, and in the elections of 1874 and 1875, the Democrats, as it were suddenly and by surprise, carried their state tickets in many northern states and even elected their candidate for governor in Massachusetts. In the congressional elections, moreover, they were overwhelmingly successful, supplanting a Republican majority of almost 100 in the House of Representatives by a Democratic majority almost as large. In the slowly changing Senate, however, the Democratic vote was still less than one-third. Before the presidential election of 1876, this tidal wave of success was running much less strongly, but it had by no means subsided. 140 contested election of 1876 to 1877. The National Democratic Convention of 1876 nominated for the presidency Samuel J. Tilden of New York, a man who had proved both his ability and his integrity in the highest administrative offices of his state. The Republican Convention named Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio. Once more, Democratic majorities seemed to sweep the country, but the existence of three dual state governments in the South threw the whole result into grave doubt and produced one of the most extraordinary situations in the history of the country. In Louisiana, the official returning board, through whose hands the votes of every voting precinct in the state must pass, was under the absolute control of W.P. Kellogg, the Republican governor who had been recognized by the federal government and supported by federal troops in 1874. This board, after refusing to comply with the law in several respects, declared the Republican presidential electors chosen, and the governor signed their certificates. Mr. McHenry, however, of the opposite party, claimed to have been elected governor and gave certificates to the Democratic electors. Two sets of votes, therefore, were sent to Congress from Louisiana. There had been similar double returns from Louisiana in 1872, and the houses had then refused to count the electoral vote of that state at all. In Florida, the returning board contained but one Democrat, the Attorney General, and its majority, exercising judicial prerogatives and counting the votes which the Supreme Court of the state had forbidden the board to assume, declared the Republican electors chosen. The Attorney General, the Democratic member of the board, gave certificates to the Democratic electors. As in Louisiana, so here, the governor of the state was a Republican and signed the certificates of the Republican electors. In South Carolina, too, as in Louisiana, there were two governors and two legislatures, each claiming to have been elected and to constitute the only legitimate government of the state. The Republican government was protected and supported in effecting its organization by federal troops, who had also in many places guarded the polls at the elections where the Democrats claimed they had made a free election impossible. Just as in Louisiana, therefore, each set of electors received their certificates of election, the one from the Republican governor in possession of office, the other from the Democratic governor demanding possession of office. There was a complication besides in Oregon. There the Republican electors had secured a majority, but one of them was thought to be disqualified under the law from serving in the capacity of presidential elector, and the governor gave a certificate to the Democratic elector who had received the highest number of votes. The Secretary of State, however, the official canvassing officer of the state, gave certificates to all three of the Republican electors. If these disputed votes should all be given to the Republican electors, the Republican candidates for the presidency and vice presidency would be chosen by an electoral majority of one. But if any one of them should be lost to the Republicans, they would lose the election also. The House of Representatives was Democratic, the Senate Republican, and it was impossible that the two houses should agree with reference to the nice questions which would arise in counting the votes from the states from which there were known to be double returns. In January 1877, therefore, an electoral commission was created by Congress to consist of 5 members chosen by the Senate, 5 members chosen by the House of Representatives, and 5 justices of the Supreme Court, in the hope that the puzzling and intricate questions involved might be decided with judicial impartiality. Unhappily, however, every vote of the commission was a vote upon partisan lines. It contained 8 Republican and 7 Democratic members, and in each case all disputed questions were decided in the favor of the Republicans by a vote of 8-7. The process of decision was very slow and, of course, generated the most profound excitement. Not until the 2nd day of March, 2 days before the date set by the Constitution for the inauguration of the new president, was the counting finished and the result officially determined in the joint session of the houses. The feeling was universal that, leaving aside all questions of fraud in the elections, which affected both parties almost equally, the whole affair threw profound discredit upon those concerned. A perilous conflict had no doubt been avoided, but it had proved impossible to get a commission from Senate, House, and Judiciary in which either the majority or the minority would vote upon the legal merits of the cases presented. Even members of the Supreme Court had voted as partisans. 141. The Centennial Year. Soon after his inauguration, President Hayes very wisely ordered the withdrawal of the federal troops from the South, and the Republican governments of South Carolina and Louisiana, upon whose de facto authority his election had turned, were quietly superseded by the Democratic governments which had all along claimed the right to occupy their places. In Florida, too, decisions of the courts effected the same result. The supremacy of the white people was henceforth assured in the administration of the Southern states. May 10, 1876, had witnessed the opening of an international industrial exhibition at Philadelphia, which had been arranged in celebration of the centennial anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. It was a fit symbol and assurance of the settled peace and prosperity which were in store for the country in the future. All the great commercial and industrial nations were represented in its exhibits, among the rest, of course, England, whose defeat the exhibition was planned to celebrate. Her presence made it also a festival of reconciliation. It spoke of peace and goodwill with all the world. It surely is not fanciful to regard it besides as a type and figure of the reconstruction and regeneration of the nation. The Union was now restored not only to strength but also to normal conditions of government. National parties once more showed a salutary balance of forces which promised to make sober debate the arbiter of future policies. It showed the economic resources of the South freed, like those of the North, for a rapid and unembarrassed development. The national spirit was aroused, and conscious now at last of its strength. The stage was cleared for the creation of a new nation. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Epochs of American History, Division and Reunion, 1829 to 1889, by Woodrow Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The New Union, 1876 to 1889. 142. Unstable Equilibrium of Parties, 1876 to 1889. The first Congress of Mr. Hayes's administration was made up of a Democratic House and a Republican Senate. The second Congress of his term was Democratic in both branches, but the Democrats gained no permanent advantage by their control of legislation. They were not yet a compact or homogeneous party. They were, on the contrary, a party made up of various elements, some of which were notoriously inclined to financial and other experiments in legislation with which conservative opinion could have no sympathy. They sought, too, to force some of their political measures upon the president by attaching them as writers to the appropriation bills. And the president's steady resistance to these irregular means of mastery served to consolidate the Republicans and put them upon their mettle. The Democratic majorities in the House were no longer large. They had steadily grown smaller from election to election since the great tidal wave of 1874. The Republicans won the presidential election of 1880 by a majority of 59 in the electoral vote, overcame the Democratic majority in the House of Representatives and brought parties to a tie in the Senate. Then once more, by the operation of causes hardly to be discerned with certainty in the absence of direct issues of policy between the parties, another wave of Democratic success swept over the country in 1882, creating a Democratic majority of more than 80 in the House of Representatives, though the Senate passed under the control of the Republicans. There had been ignoble dissension among the Republicans over the distribution of offices by Mr. Garfield, the new president. Mr. Garfield had been assassinated by a disappointed and desperate office seeker, and Mr. Arthur, who had been made vice president to please that branch of his party which was least in the confidence of the country, had succeeded to the office of president. Once again, however, in the elections of 1884, when another president was to be chosen, the Democratic majority in the House fell off. But such advantage as the Democrats had lost, the Republicans enabled them to regain by nominating for the presidency and vice presidency candidates who represented seriously discredited elements within the party. And the Democrats, for the first time since Buchanan, elected their candidates Grover Cleveland of New York and Thomas A. Hendricks of Indiana. Until Mr. Cleveland's term of office closed with the first century of the Constitution, they maintained their supremacy in the House, although they failed to increase their strength materially in the Senate. The presidential elections of 1876, 1880, and 1884 had shown a singularly nice balance between the two national parties in the aggregate popular vote. That vote, which was about 8,300,000 in 1876, has swelled to 9,200,000 in 1880 and to more than 10 millions in 1884, but the relative strength of parties had changed scarcely at all while it grew. In 1876, the Democrats had had a majority of a little more than 250,000 in the aggregate vote. In 1880, the Republicans had plurality of 915, more than 300,000 votes having gone to the Greenback Party, and in 1884 the Democrats had a plurality of less than 63,000, some 300,000 votes having again been diverted to other parties. 143 new economic questions 1880 to 1889. While parties were thus held in equilibrium, most of the men who had guided the legislation of the War and of Reconstruction passed out of politics, and their places were taken by new men. Old questions, now practically settled, fell into the background. New questions bred of the new times thrust themselves imperatively forward. By an act passed in 1880, the use of federal troops at the polls had been forbidden, and with the abandonment of federal interference with elections, the Southern question fortunately lost its prominence in party programs. Financial, economic, and administrative interests produced the problems of the day. The most prominent of these questions were the coinage of silver, the reform of the civil service, the reduction of tariff duties, the control of corporations, particularly the great interstate railways, and the purification of the ballot. Divisions of opinion concerning these matters by no means coincided with party lines. The platforms of the two parties became singularly alike, and upon many points alike ambiguous. Neither party could feel sure beforehand of its vote upon particular questions. Upon the most familiar of the subjects of debate, the tariff, there existed, of course, traditional views. The Democratic Party had always in the past been a low-tariff party. Its utterances upon this head had been more consistent and more unbroken in their consistency than its deliverances upon any other point of policy. The Republicans, on their part, had not only inherited the doctrines of the Whigs, but had also put them into practice to an extent hitherto unprecedented in the financial legislation of the war times. But nothing had shown more extraordinary growth since the war than manufacturing industry, and there was now an influential section of the Democrats also, led by Mr. Samuel J. Randall of the great mining and manufacturing state of Pennsylvania, which was opposed to a reduction of the tariff duties. While repeated efforts were made, therefore, by the advocates of tariff reform to secure legislation upon this subject during the period we have now under consideration, nothing of any consequence was accomplished. In 1882, a tariff commission, constituted by act of Congress, traveled through the country, taking testimony as to the state of industry and the effect upon it of the existing tariff laws. And in the session of 1882 to 1883, acting upon the report of this commission, Congress provided for a slight reduction of duties. But beyond this, nothing was done. The tariff question can hardly be said to have become definitively a party question until Mr. Randall's death broke the influence of the protectionist minority among the Democrats, and President Cleveland's message of December 1887 finally committed his party to the old doctrines by its explicit and outspoken advocacy of tariff reform. The question of silver coinage confused party lines more than any other. By an act of July 14, 1870, it had been provided that the bonds of the United States should be paid in coin, and an act of February 12, 1873, had suspended the coinage of silver except for subsidiary coins. The value of silver, therefore, as compared with gold, had very greatly depreciated, to the detriment, of course, of the silver mining interests of the West. Gold was regarded, therefore, by that large class of persons who cannot comprehend monetary questions as dear money, and the coinage of silver was demanded in order that the country might have an abundant supply of cheap money. This demand came not from the commercial portions of the country, of course, where money was understood, but from the agricultural and mining regions of the South and West. The earnest opposition of the moneyed interest of the East to the legislation proposed only confirmed its advocates in their conviction that it was necessary for the protection against financial tyranny, against the government of the country from Wall Street. In February 1878, a Republican Senate and a Democratic House united in passing the Bland-Allison-Silver bill by heavy majorities over the President's veto. As originally proposed in the House by Mr. Bland of Missouri, the bill provided for the unlimited coinage of silver at the old ratio of 16:1. In the Senate, upon the motion of Mr. Allison of Iowa, the provision for unlimited coinage was stricken out, and a clause was substituted which required the purchase of a large amount of silver bullion every month by the Treasury, and its steady coinage into money. Thus amended, the bill became law. It obliged the Secretary of the Treasury to purchase at least $2 million worth of silver bullion every month, and authorized him to expend, if he should see fit, as much as $4 millions monthly for that purpose. The bullion bought was to be coined into dollars, each of which should contain 412½ grains of standard silver, and these dollars were made legal tender without restriction of amount in payment of all debts. 144 the civil service and the ballot, 1880 to 1889. In the matter of the reform of the civil service, there had been equally confusing party divisions, but more satisfactory progress in legislation. Congress had withdrawn its support from the reform, as we have seen in 1874, and the members of both houses had too keen a relish for their part in dispensing the patronage of the government to wish to see legislation upon the subject revived. But after the scandalous and tragical events of the spring and summer of 1881, it was impossible to resist any longer the pressure of opinion. Almost immediately after Mr. Garfield became president, in March 1881, both of the senators from New York resigned their seats in the Senate because he would not allow them to dictate his choice of a collector for the port of New York. The country had dramatic evidence of the extent to which congressional control of appointments had been carried. On the 2nd of July of the same year, Mr. Garfield was shot by a man who had failed to obtain an appointment, receiving wounds of which he died in September. The country had tragical proof of what clamor for office meant. On January 9, 1883, therefore, the Pendleton Civil Service Act passed Congress with the support of both parties. It was proposed by a Democratic Senator, Mr. Pendleton of Ohio, in a Republican Senate, passed the Senate and the Democratic House by good majorities, and was promptly signed by the Republican President, who had previously declared his willingness to put such an act into execution. It authorized the President to order appointments to the civil service to be made by competitive examination and to constitute a civil service commission for the management and development of the system. President Arthur put it immediately into force, and under his Democratic successor, Mr. Cleveland, its administration was extended and perfected. The system did not gain full acceptance or support at once, of course, from either party, neither was it made to include all grades and branches of the service, but steps were taken towards the completion of the reform which could not be retraced. They were taken also with courage and in good faith. The purification and protection of the ballot lay with the states, not with Congress, and the period is made noteworthy by reason of the adoption by state after state of the Australian system of voting. An impetus was given and an example set in this reform which assured its final universal adoption throughout the Union. The main features of the reform were the facilitation of independent nominations for office, the official printing of the ballots to be used, their distribution to the voters by sworn officers of election, and the isolation of the voter while preparing his ballot. 145 Interstate Commerce Act, 1887. That Congress should occupy itself with economic questions was made imperatively necessary not only by the extraordinary growth of economic interest, but also by the portentous concentration of capital in the hands of corporations and of small groups of capitalists. Both capital and labor were effecting their own organization independently and upon the grand scale. It was necessary to see to it in the interest of society that they should not be too far beforehand with the law. Some means of controlling them in the common interest it became imperative to devise. On the one hand, not only trades unions, but also vast federations of unions, national associations of the trades, were forming, and on the other hand, great combinations of capitalists, not only into corporations which the law already undertook to control, but also into trusts and combines, for which the law had as yet devised no machinery of control. The invention of elaborate and costly machinery for all branches of manufacture was steadily increasing the amount of capital necessary for even the initial steps in establishing industries of all sorts, great and small. And for the maintenance of the greater sort of associations of individuals were giving place to associations of companies. It was against these great combinations of capital that the laborers were themselves combining to resist the attempts then already making and sure to be made upon an even greater scale thereafter to control rates of wages against the influence of competition for labor. For Congress, the whole question was typified by the concentration under the management of a few companies of the great railway systems of the country. As the enormous growth of railways continued, and link after link was completed in the great systems of road, which were binding the country together in all its parts, the old order of separate lines of railway under the management of separate companies was rapidly giving place to joint management under monster corporations. The trade of the country was largely in their hands. They could discriminate as they pleased in both their passenger and their freight rates between individuals and even between regions. They could make or ruin particular regions or persons or companies as their interests suggested. Congress had constitutional power to legislate concerning post roads and interstate commerce. The states had many of them sought to regulate the railways already, and in 1887 Congress passed an Interstate Commerce Act which forbade discrimination in rates, the pooling of rates by competing lines of railway, or the division among them of earnings. A semi-judicial tribunal was constituted to enforce the provisions of the Act. This Interstate Commerce Commission speedily became one of the most important tribunals of the country, administering the provisions of the law with both firmness and discretion to the fortunate correction of many abuses. 146 Administrative Questions, 1886-1887. The disputed presidential election of 1876 had rendered painfully evident to the whole country the necessity for more satisfactory provisions with regard to counting the electoral votes, which had long been evident to thoughtful public men. and Congress presently undertook to legislate upon the subject, not promptly as might have been expected after the hazards of the Electoral Commission, because it was difficult to agree upon details, but with a satisfactory discernment of the proper remedy. By an act approved February 3, 1887, it was provided that each state might determine under its own laws the manner in which definitive judicial decisions of every contest arising out of a presidential election should be made, and that the houses could not reverse a decision which had been reached in accordance with such state laws, except in cases where there was a conflict of tribunals within a state and the houses could not agree in deciding the question which of those tribunals was the lawful tribunal under the laws of the state concerned. By a concurrent vote of the two houses, however, electoral votes not protected by state judicial determination of their validity might be rejected. An earlier law, approved January 18, 1886, had made sensible provision for the official succession to the presidential office in case of the death or disability of or both the president and the vice president. The Secretary of State was put first in order of succession, and after him the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of War, the Attorney General, the Postmaster General, the Secretary of the Navy, and the Secretary of the Interior, in the order named, provided in each case, of course, that the officer upon whom the succession devolved were otherwise eligible for the office of president under the terms of the Constitution. Upon such administrative measures, the two parties did not find it difficult to agree. They agreed also during the closing days of the session of 1887 to a repeal of the Tenure of Office Act, by which Congress had sought to control President Johnson's dismissals from office in 1867. 147. Pensions, immigration, polygamy. The other leading questions of these years were the granting of pensions and the regulation of immigration. Congress had hastened from one lavish vote to another in providing pensions for the soldiers who had fought in the Civil War, until at length generosity had passed into folly. President Cleveland for the time put a stop to the reckless process by a vigorous use of his veto power. Immigration had long since become a threat instead of a source of increased wealth and material strength, bringing as it did the pauperized and the discontented and disheartened of all lands, instead of the hopeful and sturdy classes of former days. And public opinion was becoming very restless about it. But Congress did little except act very harshly towards the immigrants from a single nation. By an act of 1888, the entrance of Chinese into the country was absolutely cut off. Congress undertook to, under the leadership of Senator Edmunds of Vermont, to deal in summary fashion with polygamy among the Mormons of Utah. The charter of the Mormon Church was declared forfeit, polygamy was made criminal, and all persons were excluded from the elective franchise in the territory who would not take oath to obey the stringent provisions of the federal statutes of 1882 and 1887, aimed at the principal domestic institution of the Mormon sect. In November 1889, 4 new states entered the Union: North and South Dakota, Montana, and Washington. The tale of states has now reached 42. 148. End of the first century of the Constitution, 1889. The end of the first century of the Constitution had come. It was but 24 years since the close of the war between the states, but these 24 years of steam and electricity had done more than any previous century could have done to transform the nation into a new union. The South had been charged as if by a marvel into likeness to the rest of the country. Freed from the incubus of slavery, she had sprung into a new life. Already she promised to become one of the chief industrial regions of the Union. She had discovered resources of coal and iron beneath her rich soil of which she had never dreamed before. Manufactures sprang up on every hand. She lost her old leisure and her old-time culture, but began very fast to build the material foundations for a new leisure and a new intellectual life. In the presence of such changes, the old alienation of feeling between the sections could not survive. Northern capital poured into the South. Northern interests became identified with Southern interests, and the days of inevitable strife and permanent difference came to seem strangely remote. The growth of wealth throughout the country was unprecedented, marvelous. Individual fortunes came almost suddenly into existence, such as the country had not dreamed to see in former times, such as the world had seldom seen since the ancient days of Eastern luxury or Roman plunder. Self-indulgent and fashion displayed and disported themselves as never before in the sober republic, and the nation felt itself big and healthy enough to tolerate even folly for the sake of freedom. New troubles came, hot conflicts between capital and labor, but the new troubles bred new thinkers, and the intellectual life of the nation was but the more deeply stirred. As the equilibrium of parties tempered political action, so the presence of new problems quickened sober thought, disposed the nation to careful debate of its future. The century closed with a sense of preparation, a new seriousness, and a new hope. End of Chapter 13. End of Epochs of American History, Division and Reunion, 1829 to 1889, by Woodrow Wilson.